Okay, guys. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicola Corti. I'm working for Yelp, and today we're going to talk about the curious case of Android button. If you don't know Yelp, we are a tech company based in San Francisco. I'm actually working from the Hamburg office in Germany, and just a few words. So our mission is to connect people with great local businesses, so you can use our application to search for restaurants, plumbers, relocation services, whatever, and you will get like hopefully really good results. And a few notes about me. As I said, I'm working as an Android developer. I'm in the Beats core team, so mostly working on core UI tools. My Twitter handle is CortiNico, and I love to consider myself a community lover. So I'm currently managing the GDG chapter in Pisa, Italy, and yeah, those are my passions. So I'm happy to chat with all of you about this. Feel free to stop me afterwards. But that's more than enough. So buttons. A lot of people and a lot of colleagues actually ask me, are you really going to talk about buttons? That sounds so simple, and what else do you want to say about that? Actually, today we're gonna see that there is a lot to talk, and I also struggled a lot to find, to decide what to say, because I only have 40 minutes, and honestly, I could speak about that for, I don't know, 2 hours, even more. But the idea here is that we will deep dive inside the framework to see how they're actually implemented, and once we understand that, we can definitely craft our own button. I'll just want to give you some context. At Yelp, we mostly have 2 applications. The consumer application is the one that you can download from the Play Store and search for businesses, and a business owner application. And we try to follow this consistency first principle. So our idea is try to make sure that the user experience across these 2 applications is somehow consistent. And the problem is that the old code base for Android is around 3 million lines of code, Java and Kotlin, and we have I think nearly 300 buttons, instances of buttons. So it's a pretty big environment, and for us, those play a really critical role because buttons are the first widgets your users interact with. So we worked a lot on that, and today I'm going to share with you what was our experience. But first, I think it makes sense to warm up the stage with a little bit of button history. And I think we need to go in 1980. This is the Xerox star. So if you go on Wikipedia on history of graphical user interface, this is probably the first screenshots that you will see there. And we already have the concept of button. It's nothing more than a rectangle with some text inside. So this concept of button as a way to let the user interact with your interface was it's really, really old, and it crosses several milestones. I think that one of the most important milestones that we need to mention is this Skeuomorphic UI movement. So the idea was to try to design your UI in a way that it looks similar to the reality. So here we see the calculator from iOS 6, and similar was also the one on Android till Gingerbread. And the idea is I want to make it easier for you, user, to interact with that. This should be similar to the calculator that you have on your desk every day. So you see those buttons, they have those complicated gradients and colors. And also, this is another example I think is really meaningful. This is the volume slider for iTunes, and you see that the icon is the same as the volume control of your Hi-Fi system. So the idea is hey, this is part of your environment, of your real-world environment. I'm going to design something that is similar, so you already know there is something that will control the volume. Okay, cool, but the problem here was that we needed to move a lot of assets, a lot of PNGs on the network. So we went to another milestone for buttons design, that is the flat UI. And here we see an example of the same calculator, but on iOS 7. So the UI is drastically changed. Honestly, this was first introduced with Windows Phone 7 in 2010, and as I said, with iOS 7 Plus 2013. And the idea was to have a lighter interface. So in this way, also for users, it should be easier to use, more clean, more streamlined, and at the same time, it's definitely easier for developers to develop responsive UIs. You don't have static PNGs that they grow, but you just have like a static square, and you can like enlarge it as much as you want, and you can like design interfaces for tablets or bigger screens, and it will still look elegant. And the last iteration is what is called almost flat, or flat 2.0. This was introduced by Google with the material design in 2014, and the idea is still like, let's continue with this flat environment, but we can definitely use like shadows or subtle gradients, so not just flat colors. And the idea is try, like for example with shadows, we want to guide the users. So I give you a bigger shadow, and the bigger shadow means, oh, you need to interact with that, because bigger shadows means like this widget is nearer to me, so maybe I want to click it. So why I'm telling you this? Because all this stuff, they will play a role inside our everyday design of buttons. So let's see how we actually craft our buttons. So I'm gonna split my presentation into 4 main steps. The first one is the shape of your buttons. The second one is the typography. Then we have the hierarchy. And the last one is the feedback. So let's start from the first one, the shape. So what's the idea here? The idea here is that you want to design your buttons in a way that they look like a buttons. This could be like, can sound stupid, but your users are interacting with other applications, and you want to make sure that whenever they interact with yours, they will see, oh, this is a button, maybe I want to click it. So yeah, it's obvious, but the shape of your button plays a fundamental role. So the market standard now is to use rectangular shapes. You can definitely try to make your rectangles like as a star or as a triangle. Feel free to go for that, but I definitely recommend to user test it, run an experiment, because if the user, they don't realize that that is a button, you can have a problem because they will not understand how to interact with your widgets. Another important thing that you need to consider is the corners. Again, another market standards nowadays is that corners should be rounded. In the material design environment, they're defined as 2DP. So if you open like the material design specs, you will see like buttons, rounded corners, 2DP. Maybe after the Google I/O, I have some suspect that it's going to change a bit, but we will see in a couple of weeks. And why we use these rounded corners? Actually, there are a lot of studies around this. I can bet that basically all of your devices, or all of your physical devices, they have rounded corners. I don't think any of you has a phone with sharp edges. And the idea is like, rounded corners are available in nature, and they feel more natural. User will love to interact with them, while sharp edges, they feel like dangerous. So try to stick to rounded corners. Just decide how much rounded you want to do that, and go for that. And the last thing that you have to think about whenever you design your buttons is the shadows. So as I said, we are in this almost flat 2.0 environment, so we want to use a shadow to inform the user that they need to interact with our widgets. So I will introduce some basic concepts of the material design environment. In the material design environment, we have this material metaphor. So basically, everything is a material sheet, and we define this sort of elevation. So the elevation is how distant every element is from the base sheet. In this case, for example, on the left, we have this raise button, and it's a 2DP. So we calculate the elevation starting from the surface of the material sheet, from the surface of the bottom sheet. Obviously, like on top, we have the dialog or the picker. So whatever we want the user to interact with is higher in the elevation hierarchy. And obviously, we don't define only the resting elevation, that is like the static elevation. Those widgets, they can evolve. Users will interact with them, and so the elevation can change. That's why the material design environment defines also the dynamic elevation. So for example, the button has a resting elevation of 2DP, and whenever you click on that, 6 dp will be added, and the button will reach 8 dp. And you can see that on the left. Unfortunately, the projector is not really good, so I don't know if you see that, but on the left there are those 2 buttons that are moving up and down. So to really understand how shadows are computed on Android, we need to know also that there are 2 lights. This is extremely important. The first one is the ambient light, and is the one on the right, and it's just in front of your screen. And the second one is the key light. The key light is just above the screen. Why I'm telling you this? Because the shadows that will be drawn are computed within, using these 2 lights. So the key light will cast a shadow below your widget, and the ambient shadow will cast a shadow, a uniform shadow all around your widget. So the result shadow is something like this. So what's the point here? The point is like shadows are changing based on the position of the widgets inside your screens. So here we have an example. This is a button placed at the top of the screen. Let's try to animate it to the bottom. And you will see that the shadow is growing. And at the bottom is way, way bigger. Unfortunately, again, the projector is okay, so la la. But I think you saw it a bit. So what's the point here? The point is like when your designer is coming to you and it asks you to do the buttons in this specific way with this specific shadow, you have to take in account that these shadows is then rendered by the Android framework, and you can't change it. If you want to have another kind of shadows, if you want to have like blue shadows or red shadows, you definitely need to provide a 9 patch like all the PNGs, or stick to those. I think those are pretty good. They work fine. You probably don't need to know that, but if you're working with button, I ended up like spending an entire day discussing with designers and letting them understand that, hey, shadows on Android are working in this way and we stick to that, or you give me PNGs and I use that. So again, another important thing when you're designing buttons is this one. So you always have to decide between 2 guidelines to follow. The first one is the platform. So do I want to stick to the material design guidelines, like the one defined by Google and the one defined by the Android environment, or you want to stick to my brand? The idea here is like if you're really strong with your brand awareness, go for that. If you want your buttons to look the same across all the platforms, go for that. But you need to have like a design system that is working well. You need to have designers that are like crafting your experience properly for all the platforms. If you're not sure about that, go for the platform guideline and follow the material design guidelines, because users on Android, they already know how the widgets on the material design environment look like. So they will definitely understand better your interfaces. Okay, so that was all from the design point of view. And now it's time to deep dive. So if you saw the talk about from Romain and Chat before, this is like not so deep dive, but still, we're going to go inside the Android framework and see how the buttons are working and what's behind them. So the first thing that I want to say is what's actually an Android button. So we have this class, Android widget button, and from the support library, we have also this other class, AppCompat button. There is a subclass of that. And they're obviously inside the object hierarchy. So at the top, we have Java, object, their views, okay? But actually in the middle, there is a text view. So buttons are nothing more than a text view with a background, with a special background, and they just interact when you click with that. That's all. And moreover, see at the number of lines of code. Buttons says 182, 187 lines of code. They do nothing, really. They do absolutely nothing. While inside the text view, we have 11K, and inside view, 26K. So the point here is that please don't subclass view if you want to do a button. Okay? Those are not custom views. They're already ready inside the framework. You just need to customize them. And to customize them, you need to know how the default buttons are working to see which attributes to touch and how to change all the colors and all the backgrounds as you want. So, how we start? On Android, usually you have an XML layout. Oh, beware, I'm going to show only XML. So if you're a Kotlin fan or Java fan, sorry for you guys, but that's it, that's layout. So, we just create a button element, and we set the width and the height, okay? You probably know that. As I said, we have the button or the AppCompat button. So if you're using the support library, and if you're using the app compat activity, actually those two elements are exactly the same, because if you open the source code of app compat button, you will see that, yeah, there's a subclass of button, but there is a comment there that says like, hey, this will be automatically used when you use button in your layouts, okay? So just use button, app compat button will be injected, obviously if you use the support library, and go for that. The support library is providing us 4 default styles. Those, button, button colored, button borderless colored, and they're actually those 4. So we have 2 buttons that are raised and 2 buttons that are just text. I'm gonna focus right now on the first one, and for sake of simplicity, I'm gonna focus everything on API 21 plus, also because yesterday this account tweeted, I don't know if you know that, that's like the main SDK version account, so now you can stick to 21 and forget about whatever is before, but if you still have to support previous version, please know that mostly everything has been backported in the support library, so you should be good to go. So let's try to open this style. Small note, if you're not really familiar with style and themes, Cyril Mathieu yesterday gave an awesome talk about style, themes, and attributes. Go for that. I think all will be on YouTube. It was really awesome. So yeah, you get an overview of how styles and themes are working, but now I assume that you kind of have an idea of how they work. So if we open, we end up in the base style for this button, and on API 21, this resolves to a framework style. There is widget material button. So CMDB, and let's go inside that. We end up in this file. It's a resource, it's called styles material, and this is our style. Okay, let's open that. That's it. That's the default style that is applied to all the buttons on Android. So if you open a new project and you drop in a button inside your layout, those attributes will be applied. Let's look at some of those, in particular this one. So here we set min height and min width. Min height to 48 dp to make sure that the clickable area is big enough for the user to click on the button. And also we set the min width to 88 dp because the idea is to have like sort of rectangular buttons usually, unless you want to change that. We set the gravity, so the text will be centered inside the widget. And the most important thing, and that's like where everything happens, and it's where you need to pay a lot of attention, is the background. In this case, the background is button default material. So again, CMDB, and let's go inside. What's inside? Inside, we just have a REPL of a color. There is color control light, and is applied on an item. There is button default material shape. So here we need this preview of a button, so that's what is actually rendered on the screen. And as I said, this attribute is a theme attribute, and this is basically a color. And this is the color, in this case is gray, and this is the color that is applied on all the widgets when you interact with them. So for example, when you click on a button, you will see that there is a REPL, and the color of this REPL is defined by this theme attribute. So if you go in your theme and you change this, you will change how button interacts, and also how all the other widgets that are using this attribute renders when the user interact with them. And also we have, this REPL is applied on this drawable. Let's see what's this button default material shape. So here I'm exploding that. The first thing that we have is an inset. So here I replace the dimension to make it a little bit more readable. So we have this inset drawable. The inset drawable is doing nothing more than this. So if you try to drag and drop a button, you will see this. You will see that the button is inside a little area. And actually, this little area is 6 dp top and bottom, and 4 dp left and right. Why this? This is done because the buttons needs to have enough area to draw the shadow. So please use it, because otherwise, if you don't pay attention, your shadows could be clipped. Although if the shadow is pretty big, it can be clipped anyway. But the idea here is to provide at least enough space for a little shadow. what's the problem here? The problem here is that you may end up discussing with your designers because your buttons are not exactly aligned, because they do not expect this 4DP on the side, and maybe they're not aware of this inset drawable that is there. So either you need to compensate or you need to explain them how those things works. Okay, then inside the inset we have a shape. There is actually a gradient drawable. It's called gradient drawable, but we are going to use it just the flat color. And the shape is a rectangle, because you want a rectangle. If you want the oval buttons, you need to change it there. And it's tinted. It's tinted using this other attribute. There is another important attribute of the framework, and it's color button normal. So this is the color that is applied as default to all the buttons. In this case, gray. Then inside we have a corners element that defines the size of the corners. We have a solid background that is white because we tint on top. And then we have a padding that is 8 dp on the side and 4 dp top and bottom. And this is actually how it looks like. So this is the file. If you open the framework and you search for the file, it will look like that. Although I exploded it, but it's more or less this one. So we created our shape. Let's put some text inside. And that's typography. I'm going to go really fast on this. Usually on the buttons, try to use a verb. Please don't use buttons with labels like awesome, because the user will never understand what's going to happen if they click on awesome. Then if you stick to the material design guidelines, buttons are all caps. So if you go for that, make sure your buttons are all caps, otherwise change it. And again, as I said, principle of least astonishment. Your users should not get astonished when they click on the button. They should get an idea of what's going to happen. If you click on login, they should get an idea that they're about to log in and not do other crazy stuff. So let's see how typography is handled. Usually on a button, what you do is just set a text attribute. This is pretty trivial. But again, don't forget that you are still applying this button style, because this is the default style for those widgets. So even if you don't provide that, this will be applied anyway. So let's see what's inside, again, this styles material. Here we have another attribute that we haven't saw before, is the text appearance. This is another theme attribute, and this is the text appearance for all of your buttons. So if we try to resolve it, again, CMDB, we end up inside this style. This is a text appearance material button. And here we see that we actually set, for example, text all caps to true. So if you want to touch the typography of your buttons, you need to act on the text appearance here. So, okay, as for now, we just did gray rectangles with text inside. Sure, but maybe we want to put some color around, because with color you provide hierarchy. So the first thing that you gotta do is define your color palette. There are a lot of tools online, like material design colors, whatever, or ask your designers to define it. Once you define your color palette, you will use contrast to provide hierarchy. What I mean? So the primary button will be in high contrast with the rest of your application. So for example, usually we pick accent colors that are really in high contrast with the rest of your application. If your application is blue, you will never pick an high contrast that is light blue. You will go with something like yellow or red. So play with high contrast for the primary action. The negative action will be like on medium contrast, and then the secondary action will be like on low contrast. The idea here is that you want to drive the users on your primary action. That's also the reason why the material design guidelines, they define a floating action button that is in the bottom right, and that's higher elevation, because you want to say like to the user, hey, this is the primary thing that you need to do on this screen. Go for that. If there is no floating action button, the material design guidelines, they define two other styles for the buttons, the raised one and the borderless. The raised one has 2 dp elevation, so you want your user to interact with that, and then we have like the secondary, that is the borderless, that is just text printed on the bottom material sheet. So here, define what works better for you. At Yelp, we basically ended up having 5 styles. So 1 primary and 1 negative that are raised, and 3 borderless, primary, neutral, and negative, because they mostly cover all of our use case. We applied our palette on top of that. and it works fine for us. We basically cover whatever we need. But this is up to you. Like, if you want to go crazy, go crazy. Let's just try to analyze which are your use cases and try to find the styles that covers all of that. Let's see actually how we change the color for buttons. So again, those are 4 default styles. They already provide one colored style for us, this one. And again, now I need to restrict my search to API 23 plus. Later on we will see why. But if we open this style, we will end up again inside the framework. So we have this style called widget material button colored. Let's open that. We end up in the same file, styles material. And this is the style of the buttons that we saw before, the gray one. And a few lines below, there is this other, widget material button colored. And with this dot notation, this style is inheriting everything from the previous style. So everything will be applied, plus 2 other attributes, background and text appearance. And that's exactly what we want, because text appearance on the button here is white. So here is where we are changing the color of the text, and the background is different. This is blue. Previously it was green. So we set another background. We override that. And we have this drawable button colored material. So again, CMDB, and let's go inside. It's like that, okay, yeah, wall of code. But that's it. It's something similar to what we saw before. So inset, ripple, shape, corners, solid, and padding. And the only thing that changed here is this one, is the tint. Okay? Previously was a theme attribute, color, button, normal. And here we have another color. There is button, color, background, material. But here, one thing. This is not a theme attribute. And this is not even a color. Like if you try to CMDB this, you will not end up into a X color somewhere. But this is actually a file. So button, color, background, material. And this is what is called a color state list. So here we define a set of items. There are set of states. And for all of them, we define the color. So first of all, we have 2 items. The first item set this attribute state enabled to false. So this will be applied when the button is not enabled. And the other case will be applied when the button is enabled. So how they work, they are resolved from the top to the bottom. So please try to be more specific with the first one and more generic with the last one. Because otherwise, if you reorder them in the other way, the disabled one will never be catched. Because the first one is the item with no state definition, so it will catch all the states of your buttons. So looks like we need to handle also the disabled states. So that's how the button look like on Android when you disable them. And what's happening here? We just set the color to color button normal. So again, gray. And we also apply an alpha. So those are, again, those 2 theme attributes. One, we already saw it, is the color button normal, and the other is the disabled alpha. Is an alpha that is applied on top on all of your widgets when they are disabled. So another point of control for you. And in the normal state, like in the default state, we just use the color accent. There is the color with the highest contrast for us. So that's how we build our primary button, basically. Okay, so far so cool. We already have those styles from the support library. But here we have a little problem. Okay, so let's say that we actually want to have a secondary button with, so no gray, no accent, so in this case blue, but we want to have a raised red button. So we basically have 2 ways to do that. Either using a theme overlay, but this works only with the XML. So if you want to change dynamically at runtime, this will not work. Or, I mean, will not work, you can't do it. Or you need to use the background tint attribute. Let's see how they work. So we need 2 buttons now. We're going to achieve something like that. And so in the first case, we can apply a theme overlay. So on API 21+, we can like override the theme locally in this widget, providing this Android theme attribute and passing a style. Or we can set the background tint to a color, in this case, color red. This is my red. Okay, this is trivial. This is trivial as well. Let's see how it looks like. It's nothing more than a style, and here we inherit everything from theme overlay, up compact, light, or dark. It's up to you. And those theme overlay are like special themes. They don't define all the attributes, and they're specifically designed to be used for this kind of stuff, like overriding attributes locally on widgets, on specific part of your hierarchy. And here what we do, we just set the color accent to red, because in this case, for that specific widget, we want the accent to do not be blue, but to be red. Okay, sure, all works fine, but we have a problem. So when you just like run the application, yeah, you will have these. But what's going to happen if you set enabled to false? This is going to happen. And this is not good. So the first button is behaving correctly because we set the theme overlay. So in that context, the color accent will be red, and all the colors and all the states of the button will be respect. And so you will see there is gray, and it's fine. In the other case, the button will still be red. And that's not what we want, because the problem is that like at that point, if you have like a raised blue button and a raised red button, and if you disable both of them, one will be gray, the blue one, and one will be red. That's not what we want. And where is the problem? The problem is here. You can't set just a color for the background tint. You need to set, as we saw before, a color state list. Okay? So again, you need to create something like this. And here, you need to replace the color. Instead of having a color accent, you need to provide a color red or another theme attribute that resolves to your secondary color. Okay, guys, so this was just what you need to do to change the color of a button and make it look fine with all the other buttons. So the problem is that you need a color state list, as I said before. And what I really suggest in this case is try to stick to using only styles and backgrounds, creating new files. Okay, that's fine. But at a certain point, maybe, especially if you need to change color programmatically at runtime, have a util class where you create all of your color state list starting from a color. So my idea is that I have my button class in the code, and I want to call .setColor and give a color. And you need to make sure that when I disable a button, this is disabled. So that's what we did internally. We have this util class. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to, I cut it off those slides because it's really a lot. But yeah, go for that. It's nothing really complicated, just static, basically static methods and the return color state list starting from the color that you pass as a parameter. But now I also want to talk about the feedback. So let's see how those button reacts and how to make sure they react properly. So first important thing that you have to know whenever you're working with buttons is like buttons are alive. So they're not just rectangle that you print on the screen. They have like sort of life cycle. You need to handle those states as we saw before, like enabled, disabled, focused, pressed. So you definitely need to use color state list. You can't just pass only a color, or state list drawable if you use complex background. Then try to use repulse. Repulse, as we saw, they're already inside the buttons by default. They provide this nice animation when you click on that, and they also handle the states. So they're already aware they will be applied on something that has states, and they will automatically implement the focus state for you, so you don't need to do it. Go for them. And then the last thing, animate the shadow. Like as we saw before, when you click on something, the shadow has to grow. And now we will see how to do that. So again, to stress this, ask your designers to provide you the whole life cycle of buttons. Like, what happens when I click on that? What happens when I disable them? And the ideal thing is like, you should ask your designers to provide you a sketch file with all the possible states, and then eventually iterate on them. But please stress for this, they're not just rectangle. The problem on Android is that we actually have 17 states, and also we have all the possible combinations of them. So you can't handle all of them. Just go, I think the most important are enabled, disabled, focused, and pressed. Once you cover those 4, you should good to go. But yeah, please know that there are a lot. And also you can define your own states if your buttons is doing like, I don't know, maybe downloading and showing something, and then when the load is over, changing the state. You need to define your own state and provide all the colors and all the drawables for all the state. So, talking about the shadow, shadows on Android are defined by 2 values. The first one is the elevation attribute. That is the static part of the elevation. And then we have the translation Z. That is the dynamic part of the elevation. So basically what you do, your button will have like 2dp elevation, and then the translation Z will be animated from 0 to 6. So the total will be 8dp. So let's see how we do that, how it happens. So usually on Android, as I said, you set this elevation attribute to 2dp. If you set it to 2dp, nothing will happen because this is the default. But the problem here is that if you want to change it, because you're changing your system, you want to increase the elevation of your buttons, and you want to have 8dp, and you actually try to drag and drop a button, set 8dp, and press run, nothing will change. It will just be 2dp. And to make it change, what you need to do is do this, state list animator null. So why you need to do that? Because if you do that, when you click on your button also it will not react anymore. So the shadow will always be 8dp and it will be blocked there. So let's see what is actually this state list animator. Again, we need to go inside the styles material file that we saw before. This is the default button style. And here we have this state list animator attribute that is set to this button state list anim material. Okay, let's try to open this CMDB. And we end up here. So this is a state list animator class. Basically is a way to say how attributes of your widgets should be animated when your button, or your widget anyway, is moving from one state to another. Okay? In this case, what we want to say is like, hey, translation Z should be animated to 6 when you press the button. In this case, we need 3 items. The first one is for the pressed and enabled, both to true. The second one is for the enabled set to true. So this will be like the rest state. When the button is just there, it will be this state. And then we have the general state. Then in this case will be the disabled, because the enabled will be catched by the previous one. So let's see actually how they will look like, what we want to achieve. The first one is, as I said, pressed. So we want to achieve this. Elevation at 2dp and translation Z at 6. So here we have this set of 2 objects animator. The first one will set the translation Z to this value 2, that is button press Z material, that is 6dp in this case, and we'll reset the elevation to 2dp. Okay? So the total will be 8, and our button will have like a bigger shadow, as we see here on the bottom right. So the second state is the enabled only, so the rest one, and the button will look like that, so only 2dp. So what we do here, we animate the translation Z back to 0 to make sure we go back to 2dp total, and again reset the elevation to 2dp. So one now may think, why I'm resetting the elevation to 2dp? I should just set elevation before in the style and just animate the translation Z. Yeah, sure. But what I want to achieve is also, I want to make sure that when my button is disabled, there is no shadow. Because if you add a shadow to something that is disabled, the user may interact with that, although it shouldn't because the button is disabled. So what we have here we have, again, 2 object animators. They animate translation, they reset translation Z to 0, and they set elevation to 0. And we will achieve that one, so the button on the bottom left will have like no shadow at all. So that's how those things are working. If you want to change the behavior of these, either you change those values, like pressed animation duration, pressed animation delay, elevation material, or you provide your own state list animator. One important thing, please don't do something that I saw on GitHub several times. Don't disable buttons by changing the color, because that's not how everything is supposed to work. If you have a button that is blue and you want to disable that, and you just call set clickable to false and change the color to gray, no, guys. Buttons have states and you have to handle them, because all the accessibility stack will rely on the state of the button to see if that button should be read or not. So the button is actually enabled, you're just changing the color. So please pay attention to this. This can be a pretty complicated work. I mean, it's not super complicated. You need to do it once and then create your own framework and iterate on that. So now I'm done. Just a couple of takeaways. So the first thing that I said at the beginning, why we are doing all of this, basically because we want to achieve this consistency first. So you want to create your own framework and environments, like set of styles, however, to have your own buttons and be consistent on that. And once you have it, once you're using styles properly, you can iterate on that, you can run experiments on that, and you can try to tweak little attributes and have like a better user experience overall. Then don't be afraid to deep dive. Just CMDB, or if you search for a file and you enter one of the files that I showed you, you will get into that. And they're just inside Android Studio. I think that's really important to have an idea of how those things are working, because you really understand what's behind everything and how to better design your buttons in a better way. And also, there are AOSP mirrors on GitHub. So again, you can search for classes, layout files over there, take inspiration. And the last thing is, buttons are alive. You never do this work once. You probably need to iterate on that. So try to make sure that your button framework is solving your use cases and that you're fine with that, and never stop doing this. So create a good environment that you can iterate on afterwards. And that's all for me. Couple of two things. So we are actually giving another talk today. My colleague Jonathan is doing it. Want to make a change, stop talking and start listening at 2:25 the main hall. And we are hiring. So I'm around. Feel free to reach me. We have offices in London, Hamburg, so they're pretty near to here, and San Francisco. So we have openings everywhere. Feel free. Those are my contacts. And now I'm open for questions. No questions, it's fine. Thanks.